My name is Myra, and I am 29 years old. For 9 consecutive summers during my childhood, my parents dropped me off at my aunt's roadside store in northern Michigan every June and picked me up in late August so my older brother could have what my mother fondly called real family vacations. 9 years, 9 postcards, and 9 distinct versions of the exact same painful lesson. On the afternoon I received my high school diploma, my beat-up car was already fully packed in the driveway. By midnight, I was unpacking my life in an entirely different state, and my family didn't even know which one. It took them 4 long years to finally locate me. And when they finally stood in the middle of my bustling café, 2,000 miles away from our hometown in Ohio, my mother took a slow look at everything I had built with my own hands. The very first sentence out of her mouth confirmed that she hadn't driven all that way to apologize for abandoning me. She had driven all that distance to collect something she believed she was owed. To understand why I walked away without a word, you have to go back to the summer I turned 8 years old and the sky blue suitcase that started everything. The suitcase appeared on my bed on the absolute last day of 2nd grade, sky blue, hard plastic shell, with little black wheels. My mother presented it to me like a grand birthday gift, smiling the bright, rehearsed smile she normally reserved for Sunday church services, telling me it was my very own big girl suitcase. I was 8 years old. I naively assumed that suitcases meant airplanes, and airplanes meant Disney World, because that was where my parents had taken my 10-year-old brother, Danny, the year before. Instead, 2 days later, my father drove us 5 hours north to Torch Bay, Michigan, where my Aunt Linda lived in a small greenhouse that smelled perpetually of dark coffee and fresh lake water. My parents stayed just long enough to eat a quick lunch at a kitchen table. Then my father carried my blue suitcase up the porch steps, and my mother knelt down to my eye level to deliver the sentence I would hear repeatedly for the remainder of my youth: "Strong kids don't make a fuss, Myra." She kissed my forehead, climbed back into the car, and drove off toward the airport with Danny waving from the back seat, bound for Orlando. I stood on that wooden porch, and did precisely what I had been instructed to do. I didn't make a fuss. I was already remarkably good at staying quiet, which should have deeply worried someone. Here is the specific detail that took me 20 years to state out loud. The family trip to Orlando had been officially booked in March, and the blue suitcase was purchased in April. Nobody bothered to say a single word to me until June, which meant the calculated plan to send me away existed for 3 full months, before anyone decided I deserved a sentence of explanation. When people ask me now why I left home so quietly at 18, with every detail meticulously arranged months in advance, I tell them the absolute truth. I learned that exact method from my mother. She simply never anticipated that I would be the one holding the blue suitcase. Every summer that followed unfolded in the exact same mechanical shape. During the 2nd week of June, the blue suitcase was loaded into the trunk of my father's car. 5 hours north, a quick lunch at Aunt Linda's table, and the car pulling away with 3 people inside. Then, invariably during some week in July, a glossy postcard would arrive in Linda's mailbox addressed to me in my mother's round, cheerful handwriting: Orlando the 1st year, Yellowstone the 2nd, the Grand Canyon, San Diego, Niagara Falls. 9 summers, 9 individual postcards, and every single one carried the exact same cheerful line on the back: "Wish you were here." Aunt Linda would hand the card over to me without uttering a single word, and later I would catch her quietly sliding it into an old showbox on her pantry shelf, like she was preserving evidence for a trial that nobody had officially scheduled yet. I used to read those postcards over and over, searching for a hidden message of affection that simply wasn't there. It took me years to realize what was actually missing. Not once did a card say "we miss you," and not once did one say "next year you're coming with us." The message was never an apology. It was a public caption showcasing the real family having its vacation. In September, my elementary school teachers would assign the standard essay every child in Ohio writes: "What I did on my summer break." I would write about my aunt's bakery in Michigan and receive a B+, while my mother proudly stuck Danny's vacation photos on the refrigerator, two completely different versions of the same summer held up by the exact same magnet. I stopped writing those essays honestly around the fourth year, and nobody in my house ever noticed the difference. To be entirely fair to my parents, and I have spent years learning how to be exactly that fair, and not 1 inch more, the story didn't originate with a blue suitcase. It originated in a hospital room. When Danny was 6 and I was 2, he was diagnosed with pediatric leukemia. I have zero conscious memory of those years, but I grew up entirely inside the emotional architecture it created, 4 continuous years of heavy chemotherapy, church fundraisers, and a deep freezer packed with casseroles from sympathetic neighbors. My mother slept in a stiff vinyl chair beside his hospital bed for so many nights that her posture permanently adapted to it. My father worked endless overtime shifts at the printing plant just to maintain our health insurance. And somewhere inside that long, terrifying emergency, my family permanently reorganized itself into a shape that possessed a singular center, and that center was Danny. I understand the human logic of it. A house on fire naturally organizes around the flames. Danny officially entered remission in 2003, celebrated with the ceremonial hospital bell, bright balloons, and a framed photograph that still hangs prominently in my parents' front hallway. He was 10, I was 6. That milestone should have marked the absolute end of the emergency. Instead, it became our family's founding charter. My parents emerged from those harrowing years with a permanent mission statement, making memories with Danny because we almost ran out of chances to make them. And they emerged with an unshakable belief about me that hardened like wet concrete: Myra is the easy one. Myra is healthy. Myra doesn't need anything from us. The summer vacations without me didn't begin during his illness. They began in 2005, 2 full summers after he was declared completely cured. The medical emergency had ended, but the emotional hierarchy it built did not. Nobody ever looked at the little girl carrying her own suitcase up Aunt Linda's porch steps and asked whether the triage was still necessary. Triage had simply become the only way our family knew how to love. The summer I turned 10, I attempted to make my case. The family destination that year was the Grand Canyon, and I wanted to see it so desperately that my chest physically ached. I approached it like a serious adult because, even at 10, I was an obsessive planner. I packed my small bag a week early and wrote a neat list titled Reasons I Should Come, listing my top reason: I have never seen anything a mile deep. I practiced my presentation in the bathroom mirror, then stood in the kitchen and delivered it while my mother dried dinner dishes, and my father leaned against the doorframe, spinning his truck keys on one finger. When I finished, my mother set her dish towel down, knelt to my eye level, and her voice went as soft as flannel: "This specific trip is for your brother, sweetheart. You understand, don't you? After everything he's been through." And when my chin began to tremble, she tucked a strand of hair behind my ear and finished me off with the family motto: "Strong kids don't make a fuss." My father said nothing, his signature contribution to our household. I retreated to my bedroom and didn't make a fuss. But around 9 o'clock that evening, I heard the distinct rumble of little plastic wheels across the hallway hardwood. I stepped to the top of the stairs and looked down. My blue suitcase was already fully packed, zipped, and parked beside the front door. Somebody had answered my speech hours before I had even delivered it. I never asked to go on a family vacation again. I had received my answer for all 9 summers at once. If this were a simple story of cruelty, the summers in Michigan would have been a punishment. They weren't, and that was the complicated mercy at the core of my childhood. Aunt Linda's greenhouse on the lake was the single place on earth where I was not the easy one, or the invisible one. I was simply Myra. Linda was my mother's older sister, widowed young, with no children of her own, who had spent 30 years running a popular local bakery before her hands grew too tired. She put me to work the very first week I arrived, teaching me how to roll pie crusts, when I was 9 by standing behind me with her hands resting over mine on the rolling pin. Cold hands, warm heart, she would whisper. Perfect for pastry. At her kitchen table, my opinion was actively solicited, and my answers actually changed things: what we baked, what we planted in the garden, and what movies we watched. I once overheard her introduce me to a local neighbor as her summer girl, and I walked around the rest of that afternoon feeling as though I had been knighted. One evening when I was 11, she looked at me across a slice of fresh peach pie and said softly, "In this house, Myra, you're not the quiet one. You're just Myra." She seemed about to add something else, but stopped herself, reaching over to refill my milk glass instead. There were dozens of moments like that over the years, sentences she started toward and then pulled back from, like a woman walking to the very edge of a high dock and deciding the lake water was too cold. I finally discovered what lay on the other side of those unfinished sentences the summer I turned 12. It was late at night, and I came downstairs to get a glass of water. The kitchen light was on, and Linda was sitting at the table with the phone pressed tightly to her ear. I stopped in the dark hallway because her voice held a sharp, pleading tone I had never heard before. "Then let her stay with me for the entire school year, Carol. Carol is my mother." A long, agonizing silence followed, long enough that I could hear the waves crashing against the shore outside. Then Linda spoke again, her voice going completely cold. "Because that's not how it would look to your friends, is it? That's your real answer." She must have heard the floorboard creak beneath my feet, because she turned and saw me standing in the doorway in my nightgown. Her face instantly transformed back into her cheerful summer aunt mask. She assured me that the school year in Torch Bay was boring anyway, and walked me back upstairs to bed. We never spoke of that phone call again. I was 12 years old, but I understood the basic physics of what I had overheard. Something vital had been requested, something important had been flatly refused, and my mother's refusal was based entirely on public appearances. Something fundamental changes inside a girl the year she permanently stops asking for love. My parents interpreted my complete detachment as maturity, my teachers praised me as remarkably self-sufficient. What it actually was cold arithmetic. At 14, I opened a spiral notebook and wrote a specific date on the very first page, June 2015, the month I would turn 18 with a high school diploma in my hand. Beneath it, I began a countdown list, calculating what a small apartment cost to rent in cities I had never visited, what a reliable used car cost, and how much money a girl could save if she remained completely invisible. The summer I turned 17, I pulled off my first real operation. I asked to skip the trip to Michigan so I could stay home alone and work double shifts at a local diner. My parents approved the request in less than 60 seconds. "She's just so independent," my mother proudly told the neighbors. I waited tables all summer, and every night I slid my cash tips into an envelope taped inside my closet wall, marked with a single word, "out." By graduation, that envelope had turned into a showbox containing $6,400, and not a single person in my house ever asked what I was saving for. They assumed it was for college tuition. I let them believe it. They thought I was saving for a degree. I was saving for a door. My high school graduation took place on the second Saturday of June 2015, on the school football field. By 5 o'clock that morning, my 1,900 used Honda hatchback was already fully loaded in our driveway, the blue suitcase in the trunk, the showbox of cash tucked beneath the spare tire, and beside it, the showbox containing 9 years of my mother's postcards that I had quietly taken from Aunt Linda's pantry the previous summer. My parents did attend the ceremony. I want to be entirely accurate about that, because accuracy is the only leverage I have ever trusted. They came, they sat in the folding chairs, and 40 minutes into the diploma presentations, my mother leaned over and whispered that they had to slip out early because Danny's new employer in Columbus was hosting a welcome dinner, and interstate traffic was terrible. She squeezed my wrist, whispered, "We are so proud of you, sweetheart," and walked away. When my row finally stood and the principal called Myra and Sellers, I walked across the stage, shook a stranger's hand, and looked out at two empty folding chairs with printed commencement programs resting on the seats. It didn't even hurt in the usual way, it felt like a final receipt itemizing exactly what I meant to them. That night, I ate a quiet dinner with my parents, claimed I was exhausted, and went upstairs to my room. At 4 o'clock the following morning, I placed a short note on the kitchen table beneath the sugar bowl: I am safe. I am an adult. Please do not look for me. I backed my car out of the driveway with the headlights turned off, and didn't turn them on until I reached the highway. 3 days and 2,000 miles later, I arrived in the coastal town of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, a place I had chosen off a paper atlas in the public library because the lake looked as blue as Aunt Linda's, if a lake had grown up and moved away. I rented a tiny studio apartment over a garage, secured a job washing dishes at a local waterfront café called the Lakeshore, and began building an independent life plank by plank. When a police officer knocked on my motel door 11 days later, sent by a missing persons report my mother had filed in Ohio, I handed him my adult driver's license and my new apartment lease. He verified that I was a voluntary missing adult, signed his form, and explained that while my parents would be notified that I was alive and safe, the law strictly prohibited him from revealing my physical location to them. The legal curtain had officially dropped. Over the next 4 years, I transformed my life. I went from washing dishes to becoming the Lakeshore's head baker, training under the cafe's aging owner, Rosa Delgado. When Rosa decided to retire, she offered me seller financing to purchase the business myself, requiring a $40,000 down payment. For a year and a half, I worked 16-hour days, saved every penny, and tracked my progress on a sheet of graph paper taped to my closet door. I also maintained one singular, secret thread to my past. Every June, I mailed a single, unsigned postcard of Lake Coeur d'Alene to Aunt Linda's house in Michigan, featuring a tiny hand-drawn doodle of a pie with a crimped crust on the back. It was our wordless code, letting her know I was alive without placing her in a position where she had to lie to my mother. Then, in October 2019, a regional magazine published a feature article on local small businesses, highlighting my signature huckleberry pies alongside a prominent photograph of me standing beside the cafe ovens. 11 days after the article went live online, a distant relative spotted the photo and left a comment beneath it. And on a quiet Tuesday morning shortly thereafter, the front bell above my cafe door chimed. I looked up from behind the pastry case, and there stood my mother in her tailored wool coat, with my father standing silently behind her, his right hand trembling with the fine, constant shiver of early-stage Parkinson's disease. 4 years and 2,000 miles later, my mother took a slow, sweeping inspection of my thriving business, pressed her lips together, and delivered her very first sentence. So this is what you abandoned your family for. I poured them fresh black coffee in ceramic mugs and set them on the granite counter before them, and I want you to understand precisely why I did that. It was not a gesture of emotional weakness, nor was it an attempt to seek their long-delayed approval. A woman who firmly owns the physical and emotional ground beneath her feet can easily afford to pour coffee upon it. They sat down on the bar stools like ordinary paying customers, and for 20 continuous minutes, my mother delivered her own carefully revised, authorized history of my childhood, while I listened to her narrative the exact way a person listens to a tour guide describe a house they built with their own hands. In her convenient version of reality, I had enjoyed 9 glorious, idyllic summers with my aunt in Michigan, an aunt whom I supposedly idolized. In her version, she and my father had generously gifted me total independence, which she claimed was the single greatest gift a parent could ever bestow upon a child. Just look at how wonderfully it turned out for you, she cooed, gesturing broadly to the copper lighting and the chalkboard menu. Look at this beautiful cafe. In her mind, my sudden disappearance 4 years ago was merely a temporary dramatic phase, a minor cruelty she had patiently borne with maternal grace, and she insisted that there was no need for us to relitigate the past now that I had finally gotten the rebellion out of my system. What terrified me most as I stood behind that counter was the undeniable realization that she wasn't deliberately lying. She genuinely believed every single word that left her mouth. You can hear deception in a person's voice, but my mother spoke with the absolute conviction of someone navigating a familiar road she had driven for 40 years. Somewhere across those decades of emotional triage, she had constructed a bulletproof internal story where every selfish choice she made was an act of profound love. She inhabited that lie the exact way our family had inhabited our house in Ohio, comfortably, proudly, and without ever daring to inspect the dark basement beneath it. My father said almost nothing throughout her speech, which was its own distinct dialect of fluency. His right thumb tapped rhythmically against the side of his coffee mug, an uneven, nervous tremor he seemed completely unaware of. Twice, I caught him staring intently at the framed magazine article hanging beside the register, his eyes lingering over my printed name with an unreadable expression. Finally, I asked the singular question that 4 years of absolute independence had sharpened like a razor. Why did it take you 4 years to find me, Mom? If my absence was so deeply painful to you, why didn't you look for me sooner? My father opened his mouth to answer, his voice barely a raspy whisper, I did. But before he could finish his sentence, my mother's hand landed softly on his sleeve, a touch as light as a paper napkin, and he instantly went silent. Then my mother folded her hands neatly over her purse, set her coffee mug down, and got straight to the true business of her 2,000-mile journey. Your father was formally diagnosed with Parkinson's disease back in the spring, she stated, her voice flat and matter-of-fact, as if reporting an uninteresting weather forecast. It is early stage right now, the tremors, the physical stiffness. You've clearly seen his hand. She let the heavy medical diagnosis hang in the quiet air between us, waiting for the news to break me. I stood behind the counter holding a stainless steel coffee pot, watching my father give me a small, pitifully apologetic shrug, as if his terminal neurological disease were a minor inconvenience he had accidentally invited into our lives. But my mother didn't linger on his health, because his diagnosis was merely the runway for her primary objective. Danny obviously cannot be expected to manage your father's daily care, she continued smoothly, her eyes locking onto mine with absolute authority. Danny has 2 young children, a demanding executive career, and a real mortgage to pay. You understand how impossible that would be for him. The familiar words landed squarely in the exact emotional grooves that 9 summers of abandonment had carved into my soul. Someone else's pressing needs were paramount, while my existence was expected to absorb the impact. She reached across the granite counter, her manicured fingers gripping my wrist tightly, the exact same lingering squeeze she had given me on my high school graduation day, and delivered the line she had crossed 6 states to deliver. You have always been the strong one, Myra. It is finally time for you to come home and take care of your family. She was referring to Thanksgiving. She had already constructed the entire public narrative, a triumphant family announcement, a dramatic homecoming, and her daughter returning to fulfill her filial duty. She was already mentally drafting the guest list and telling the neighbors in Ohio how selflessly I had stepped up. I looked down at her hand gripping my wrist, at her French manicure, and her mother's vintage ring, and the strangest, most liberating sensation washed over me. I felt the exact physical weight of her manipulation, and I realized it weighed no more than a paper baggage tag. 4 years of physical absence, 2,000 miles of distance, a legal missing persons curtain, an apartment lease bearing my independent signature, and a thriving business constructed plank by plank with my own calloused hands. And the very first sentence my mother offered me was an unpaid job assignment. The vacancy for the strong one had opened up in her household, and I was being formally recalled to fill it. I slowly, gently pulled my wrist out of her grip, taking it back the exact way a person carefully reclaims a sharp knife from a reckless child. I looked her dead in the eyes and said a single word, no. It was not a dramatic speech, nor was it a tearful manifesto, it was simply a quiet, unbreakable wall. And then, because the morning rush was 20 minutes away and my kitchen staff was arriving, I politely informed them that I had work to do and suggested they try a slice of our signature huckleberry pie before beginning their long drive back to Ohio. My mother's face cycled through a complex series of emotional shifts before settling into her favorite armor, wounded maternal dignity. Through the glass window, I watched her guide my father down the sidewalk toward their car. Before he climbed into the passenger seat, my father turned and looked back at me through the glass one last time. I didn't wave, and neither did he, and somehow that silent exchange was the most honest, authentic interaction the three of us had shared in 29 years. My cell phone rang late that evening from an unfamiliar Ohio area code. It was my brother, Danny. My mother had given him the phone number she had demanded from me at the counter before leaving. I almost let it go straight to voicemail, but I am intensely glad I answered it, because I want to be entirely fair to my brother the exact way I promised to be fair to everyone else, accurately, and not 1 inch more. Danny didn't open our conversation with my mother's rehearsed script. He opened with a quiet, deeply off-balance question, "Myra, is it actually true that you hated going to Aunt Linda's every summer? Did you really feel like we abandoned you?" I sat down at my kitchen table and replied softly, "I never hated Aunt Linda's house, Danny. I hated what being sent there meant." And then I laid out the unvarnished reality for him, the blue hardshell suitcase appearing in April, the 5-hour drives, the silent porch drop-offs, the glossy postcards arriving from Orlando while I sat in Michigan, and the realization that my absence had been carefully planned months in advance. The line went so completely quiet that I had to check my screen to ensure the call hadn't dropped. Then my 26-year-old brother spoke, his voice cracking with genuine emotion. "Mom told me your entire life that you loved going up there. She told me you begged to go to the lake every summer." Myra. I genuinely believed her. He didn't beg me to move back to Ohio to nurse our father, nor did he demand that I sacrifice my business. He asked for one single thing before we hung up: "Please don't disappear on me again." The following evening, I called Aunt Linda in Michigan. The moment she heard my voice, she knew a seismic shift had occurred, because our entire relationship for 4 years had consisted of a single unsigned postcard mailed every June. "They found me, Linda," I said quietly. I told her about their surprise arrival at the café, the cold coffee, the Parkinson's diagnosis, and the immediate demand for me to move home as a caretaker. Linda remained silent for a long moment. Then, my aunt took a deep breath and finally paid off an emotional debt that was 10 years overdue. "You were 12 years old," Linda confessed, her voice thick with old grief. "You came downstairs late one night for a glass of water, and I know you overheard part of my phone argument with your mother. Here is the rest of what happened that night, Myra." Linda revealed that during that summer, she had formally begged my mother to let me live with her in Michigan permanently for the school year. It wasn't meant as a temporary visit. She had prepared private bedroom space, researched the local school district, and offered to cover every single penny of my living expenses so my parents could focus entirely on Danny's medical recovery. She had even drafted the legal guardianship paperwork. But my mother had listened to her sister's passionate plea and flatly rejected the offer. And the explicit reason my mother provided for turning her down was not that she would miss her 12-year-old daughter, but rather, "Do you have any idea how terrible that would look to our friends and church members? People would ask questions if I gave my daughter away. Sending her away for the summer looks like a fun vacation, giving her away for the school year looks like abandonment." My 9 summers of exile had been precisely calculated to the exact maximum duration my absence could weigh without ruining the family photograph on the living room mantel. My entire childhood had been rationed out to serve my mother's public image. I stood in my Idaho kitchen with the receiver pressed to my ear, doing the one piece of painful arithmetic I had never permitted myself to do as a child. My abandonment had never been an accidental oversight born of medical stress. It had been a deliberate, calculated policy. Then Linda added softly, "I should have fought harder for you back then, sweetheart. Come to Michigan for Thanksgiving this year. Don't go to Ohio for them, come to my house so you never again have to wonder who you are in a room full of people who love you." I didn't sleep well for 3 consecutive nights. My internal debate was not about my parents. It was about a sheet of graph paper taped to my closet door that tracked my savings toward purchasing the café from Rosa. My current savings stood at $38,700, just $1,300 shy of the $40,000 down payment I needed to finalize the seller financing agreement. Flying back east for Thanksgiving meant spending money I needed for my future, but I also knew myself well enough to understand why the prospect terrified me. If I allowed my biological family to pull me back into their orbit, the strong one would instinctually do what she had been trained to do: absorb the pain, accommodate their demands, and disappear in place. On the 4th morning, I executed an act I had never performed in my adult life. I openly asked for help. I sat Rosa down at a corner table before we opened the cafe and laid out the absolute truth: the childhood summers, the blue suitcase, my father's neurological diagnosis, the graph paper numbers, and my deep terror of losing myself. Rosa listened intently with her arms crossed over her apron. When I finished, she looked at me with unyielding warmth and said, "The Lakeshore Cafe has stood on this lake for 40 years, Myra. It can easily wait 3 weeks for you to settle your past." And then she lowered the required down payment from $40,000 to $25,000, restructuring our seller financing contract on the spot. "I know a daughter when I see one," Rosa said firmly. "Go finish what they started." I booked my flight to Ohio that afternoon. But before I left my apartment, I reached under my bed, pulled out the dusty sky blue suitcase that had sat empty for 4 years, and packed my clothes inside it. If I was going to step back inside my parents' house, I was going to walk through their front door carrying the physical artifact of the childhood they had imposed upon me. Call it a witness, call it physical evidence. Aunt Linda met me at the Columbus airport in a rented sedan. The two of us secured a motel room near the interstate, a deliberate choice, because 2 adult women with family in town understand that a boundary you cannot physically walk away from is not a boundary at all. It is merely a trap. The evening before Thanksgiving, we made a short courtesy visit to my parents' house. Walking through those front doors was an exercise in forensic archaeology. The hallway walls remained a museum dedicated entirely to Danny, his Little League photos, his high school prom, his cancer remission bell, and his wedding, while my presence consisted of 2 small class composite photos buried among dozens of other students. My old childhood bedroom had been completely converted into a bright yoga studio. And resting prominently on top of the dining room hutch sat my mother's wicker basket containing her own duplicate set of the 9 summer postcards, displayed proudly for dinner guests to admire as proof of her maternal devotion. Our family maintained 2 distinct archives of the exact same 9 summers, hers in a wicker basket for public applause, and mine in a showbox with the raw truth written on the back. As Linda and I stepped out onto the porch to leave, my father shuffled out behind us into the cool evening air. He reached into his coat pocket and pressed a small, tightly folded piece of paper into my palm, his right hand trembling against mine. "Read this after you leave tonight, Myra," he whispered raspily. "That is all I ask." Thanksgiving Day arrived, meticulously staged by my mother like a major television production. 12 guests were seated around the expanded dining table draped in fine linens with gold-rimmed china. The guest list included extended relatives, neighbors, Danny, his wife, and their 3-year-old daughter, Ellie. Linda and I arrived together, and I carried a fresh, homemade huckleberry pie inside a white bakery box. A pie crafted by my hands, using the pastry techniques Linda had taught me, sitting dead center on my mother's table. My mother greeted us at the door with her radiant church smile, loudly announcing us to the room, "Look everyone. Our globe-trotting world traveler has finally graced us with her presence." The holiday dinner proceeded through its traditional paces, casual small talk, pass the mashed potatoes, and my uncle discussing local road construction. My father sat at the head of the table, his right hand trembling as he struggled to keep his water glass steady. I deliberately looked away whenever he caught me watching him, sparing him the indignity of pity. Then, as the turkey was being carved, my mother stood up at her end of the table, picked up her silver spoon, and tapped her crystal wine glass 3 times. Ding! 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 The entire room fell silent. Before we begin our meal, everyone, my mother announced, her voice pitched with theatrical excitement, I have some magnificent, life-changing news to share with the entire family. She delivered her announcement in 2 distinct acts. First came the tragic setup. As many of you know, my dear Frank has been experiencing some health issues, and the specialists have officially confirmed early-stage Parkinson's disease. The dinner table erupted into rehearsed gasps of sympathy, relatives offering soft murmurs of "Oh, Frank," while my father stared fixedly down at his plate like a man being discussed at his own memorial service. Then, my mother lifted her chin, smiled broadly at the room, and executed her grand finale. But here is the wonderful, miraculous news. Myra is officially moving back home to Ohio permanently to take full-time care of her father. After all, she has always been our strong, dependable girl. The entire room burst into unanimous, warm applause. My uncle raised his beer bottle in a toast, calling out, "Utter girl, Myra." A neighboring woman dabbed her eyes with a napkin, gushing about what a devoted daughter I was, while my mother stood at the head of the table bowing her head with practiced modesty, placing her manicured hand heavily onto my shoulder. I was being presented to the room as the ultimate family sacrifice, the exact same way the turkey was presented as the centerpiece of the meal. They had constructed an entire life-altering narrative about my future without ever bothering to ask me a single question. And then, right into the middle of their applause, 3-year-old Ellie spoke up from her booster seat at the end of the table, her innocent voice cutting through the room like a bell. She pointed her small plastic fork directly at me and asked her mother, "Mommy, who is that lady sitting over there?" A suffocating, dead silence descended over the table. Dana's wife frantically shushed the little girl, her cheeks flushing bright red, but the child's innocent question hung in the air above the fine china. The strong, dependable daughter, who was supposedly moving home to nurse her father, was a complete, total stranger to her own 3-year-old niece. Danny stared down at his plate in utter shame, unable to look up. I set my cloth napkin flat on the table beside my plate and stood up slowly. I had learned through 4 years of running a commercial business that you never attempt to outshout a noisy room, you simply lower your voice until everyone is forced to quiet down to hear you. I stood there in total composure until the last nervous chuckle died away completely. Then I spoke in the calm, measured tone I used to train new bakery staff. "You are partially correct, Mom," I began softly, looking around the table at 12 frozen faces. "I never made a fuss as a child. I built a life instead. But I want to be entirely clear with everyone in this room, I am not moving back to Ohio." My uncle opened his mouth to protest, but I raised my hand slightly and continued, "However, nobody in this town is ever going to claim that I left my father to suffer alone. So here is precisely what is going to happen instead." I calmly informed the entire family that I had spent the preceding 4 days arranging full service with a premier, licensed home healthcare agency in Columbus, a team recommended directly by his neurologist. A professional nurse would be arriving 3 mornings a week to manage his physical therapy, medication, and daily care, scaling up as his disease progressed. Every single invoice would be billed directly to my business in Idaho and paid by me. I did not inform them what it cost, but I knew the exact arithmetic. It was my entire graph paper down payment, 4 years of working 16-hour shifts, redirected in a single phone call to ensure my father received professional care without forcing me to surrender my freedom. Furthermore, I stated, looking straight at my mother, I will travel back to visit my father twice a year, as an invited guest, and I will speak to him on the phone every Sunday. But my name is permanently retired from this family's public announcements. Nothing about my life, my location, or my choices will ever be broadcast across a dinner table again unless I am the person standing up to speak it. My mother's face went through a terrifying series of transformations, from shock, to fury, to deep social humiliation. She slammed her wine glass down onto the tablecloth with a loud clatter and reached for her ultimate emotional weapon. If you walk out that front door today, Myra, do not ever bother coming back to this house. I looked at my mother with total emotional clarity and replied, Mom, my house key hasn't fit that front door since I was 8 years old. And then my mother completely broke down, not into genuine tears of maternal repentance, but out of absolute script failure. She sat straight up in her chair, staring blankly at the centerpiece, and spoke in a voice I had never heard her use in my entire life, a raw, hollowed-out tone. I was 12 years old. The table went completely motionless. I was 12 years old when your grandmother's legs gave out, my mother whispered to the room. Linda was 18 and already gone, living 2 states away. Somebody had to do the heavy cooking, the laundry, the house cleaning, and lifting her onto the toilet at 2 in the morning. And it was me. It was always me. And nobody ever asked me if I was okay, either. An absolute, crushing silence settled over the dining room. My mother sat exposed before her guests, revealing that the sky-blue suitcase, the postcards, and the strong kid dynamic were not things she had invented out of thin air. They were generational trauma she had inherited from her own childhood. She had survived her own youth by convincing herself that being unloved and unasked was a noble badge of honor, and she had forced that exact same miserable badge onto her daughter's chest because it was the only language of motherhood she understood. For a single, fleeting second, I saw her as a terrified 12-year-old girl standing over a hot stove, and I felt the deep, tragic near-miss of almost loving her. From the far end of the table, Aunt Linda spoke softly across 50 years of buried pain, Carol. Myra is not you. Let her go. I looked at my mother and offered her the final, kindest truth I possessed. I know, Mom, I whispered softly. Nobody asked you either. And that is precisely why I am stopping the cycle today, so nobody at this table ever has to be forced into that role again. Before I turned to leave, I pulled the folded piece of paper my father had handed me out of my coat pocket and opened it in front of the room. It was an official invoice dated August 2016 from a private investigation firm in Columbus, marked with the words, "Client cancelled search, no result." And written across the bottom in my father's shaky handwriting was a note, "Found nothing. Your mother said to stop searching. She said Myra will come back when she needs us." I looked at my father, whose tears were spilling freely down his cheeks. He had hired a private investigator to find his lost daughter 4 years ago, but when the investigator came up empty, he had surrendered to my mother's mandate rather than raising his voice. He had kept that receipt as a secret confession of his own cowardice. I walked around the table, placed my hand over his trembling fingers, and whispered, "The nurse arrives on Monday morning, Dad. And whenever you are ready to fly out to Idaho, I will personally teach you how to bake a huckleberry pie." I turned on my heel, walked out the front door into the crisp November air, and left the house forever. A full year has passed since that Thanksgiving dinner. The home healthcare nurse, Patrice, has been caring for my father 3 mornings a week, fully paid for by my business. My father sends me blurry, terrible cell phone selfies of him and Patrice, and we speak every Sunday afternoon on short, warm calls that are more than enough. My mother and I have not spoken a single word since I walked out her door. She mails me a generic Christmas card every December signed simply Mom, no apology, no warmth, and I accept that some doors in this life simply settle closed without a dramatic slam. Rosa and I officially finalized the sale of the Lakeshore Café 4 months later, and my name is now permanently painted in elegant gold lettering across the front glass door, M. Sellers, proprietor. Danny flew out to Idaho with his daughter Ellie last summer, spending 4 glorious days at my lake house. Ellie ate huckleberry pie with both hands, officially renaming me Aunt Pie, while Danny sat quietly by my stove, reading the backs of all 9 summer postcards in my showbox, offering me the only apology that ever truly mattered. "I'm so deeply sorry I never turned the postcards over to read your side, Myra. I spent 18 years of my life being treated as the invisible, disposable daughter, who was forced to carry her own blue suitcase, only to discover that the greatest triumph of my adult existence was using that exact same strength to walk away, construct my own family, and build a life where I am finally, permanently home."